They used to laugh when the wind carried the sound across the fields. It would start as a low rumble from the road, a wagon slowing down, boots crunching in the snow, a man clearing his throat before letting loose a joke that was never meant to be kind. The laughter would drift over the fence posts and settle against her barn like frost. It did not matter that she could hear it. In a small farming town, laughter traveled faster than a blizzard. Her farm sat at the edge of the valley, where the prairie flattened into a white sheet each winter. The barn was plain and square, built from old timber that had darkened with age. The roof sagged just enough to make strangers shake their heads. Beneath it, though, lay the secret that made the neighbors smirk and whisper. They called it foolish. They called it wasteful. They called her stubborn. She called it prepared. She had come to the land with nothing but a pair of steady hands and a mind that did not bend easily. Her husband had passed 5 winters earlier, leaving behind debts and a stretch of frozen ground that most folks said would never yield enough to survive. Many expected her to sell the place and move in with distant kin. Instead, she tightened her shawl, rolled up her sleeves, and studied the barn floor as if it were a puzzle waiting to be solved. The town believed farms were simple things: a house, a barn, a patch of pasture, cattle grazing under open sky in summer and huddled inside wooden walls in winter. That was the old American way, passed down from fathers to sons. It had worked for generations, so why change it? But she had seen too many winters steal more than they should. The first year alone, she lost 3 cows to the cold. They had been strong in autumn, their coats thick, their bellies full. Then the northern wind came howling down from the plains, bringing ice that cut through hide and bone. The water trough froze solid overnight. The barn, though sturdy, could not keep out the biting air that slipped through every crack. By morning, the weakest had collapsed. She buried them herself, hands blistered and heart heavy. The neighbors had clucked their tongues. Winter is hard, they said. It happens to everyone. But she watched more closely than they did. She noticed how the ground beneath the barn stayed warmer than the open fields, how the earth held on to the summer's heat long after the frost set in. She remembered stories her grandfather once told about root cellars dug deep into the soil, about how the earth could shelter what wood could not. The idea took root in her mind and would not leave. So she began to dig. When the men from town rode past and saw her hauling dirt from inside the barn, they laughed so loud that even the cows lifted their heads. Beneath the barn, they repeated, as if the words themselves were a joke. One even tipped his hat and asked if she meant to hide from winter like a groundhog. She did not answer. She kept digging. It took months. She worked by lantern light after the chores were done. She carved out a wide space under the barn floor, bracing the walls with timber, packing the dirt tight. She laid stone along the base and built narrow vents that could be opened or closed to control the air. She studied wind patterns, watching how snow drifted against the north wall and left the south side clearer. She built a sloped entry from inside the barn so the cattle could be led down when the worst of winter came. Some called it a cellar. Some called it madness. By autumn, the space beneath the barn was ready. It smelled of fresh earth and pine boards. It was not pretty, but it was solid. When she led the cattle down for the first time, their hooves clopped uncertainly against the ramp. They snorted at the unfamiliar walls, but once inside they settled. The air was still, the ground did not bite with cold. The laughter grew louder. At the general store, men leaned on barrels of flour and made sport of her farm. They said she was burying her livestock alive. They said she had lost her good sense along with her husband. One neighbor, whose land bordered hers to the east, declared that real farmers trusted the barn and the Lord, not holes in the ground. She heard every word. In a town that small, nothing stayed hidden. Yet when she walked back across her fields at dusk, the sky bleeding into deep purple, she felt no shame, only a quiet resolve. She had studied the seasons all her life. She knew the signs of a hard winter. The geese had flown south early. The squirrels had built thick nests high in the trees. Even the wind felt different, sharper somehow, as if it carried a warning. She stocked up on feed and stacked it neatly along the cellar walls. She lined the floor with straw and made sure the vents worked as planned. She tested the door hinges twice. Every nail was driven with care. When the first snow fell, it was gentle, almost kind. The valley looked like a painting, white and still. Smoke curled from chimneys. Children threw snowballs near the churchyard. The men who had laughed tipped their hats at her with grins that said they were waiting to be proven right. Then the real winter came. It arrived overnight with a wind that roared like a freight train. The temperature dropped so fast that the river iced over before dawn. Fences cracked. Tree branches snapped under the weight of frost. The sky stayed a hard, empty gray for days on end. She let her cattle down beneath the barn before the worst of it hit. Inside the earth-walled space, their breath rose in soft clouds but did not freeze in midair. She closed the vents halfway, enough to keep fresh air moving without letting the cold settle. She checked on them through the night, lantern swinging at her side, whispering to each animal as if they were kin. Above ground, the storm showed no mercy. Neighbors struggled to keep their barns warm. Fires burned day and night, eating through precious wood. Water buckets froze solid within hours. Some farmers wrapped their cattle in old blankets, others tried to block every crack in the walls with straw and cloth. Still, the cold found its way in. The wind did not let up for a week. One morning, the eastern neighbor rode past her place, his horse lathered and trembling. He did not laugh then. He glanced at her barn, snow piled high against its sides, and frowned as if trying to see through the walls. She stood by the gate, shawl pulled tight, and met his gaze without a word. By the third week, the valley had grown quiet in a way that felt wrong. No lowing of cattle drifted from nearby farms. No wagons creaked along the road. Smoke rose thinner from chimneys as families rationed their wood. She kept her routine steady. Down the ramp each morning, lantern in hand, check the feed. Break the ice in the water trough she had set inside the cellar where it froze only at the surface. Run a hand along each broad back, feeling for signs of sickness. The cattle grew calmer with each passing day, as if they understood that the earth around them was their shield. Word began to spread. A boy from town trudged through the snow to her fence, boots soaked and cheeks red from cold. He asked if it was true that her cows were still standing. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. The boy's eyes widened, not with disbelief but with something close to hope. That evening a small group gathered near her gate. They did not laugh. They did not call her foolish. They stood in the fading light, hats in hand, and asked questions in low voices. How deep had she dug? How she kept the air from turning foul? Whether the ground truly held warmth in such bitter cold. She answered simply, "The earth remembers summer," she said. "It gives back what it can." But even as she spoke, the wind rose again, sharper than before. Another front was moving in, colder than the last, the kind that tested more than timber and soil, the kind that broke spirits as easily as it broke branches. That night, she lay awake listening to the storm gather strength. The barn creaked above her, snow sliding from the roof in heavy thuds. Beneath it, the cattle shifted but did not panic. She had done all she could. The cellar was strong. The feed was measured. The vents were set just right. Still, winter was not finished with them. Far off in the darkness, a faint sound carried across the valley. Not laughter this time. Not the easy mockery of men who felt safe in their certainty. It was something else, something strained and urgent. She rose from her bed and stepped into her boots, heart steady but alert. The storm had found another target, and the night was not yet done. By dawn, the valley would wake to a sight no one had expected. And the laughter that once echoed against her barn would be replaced by something far heavier. By dawn, the valley looked like a graveyard of white drifts and bent fences. The storm had blown itself east, leaving behind a silence that pressed against the ears. She stepped out into snow that reached halfway up her boots. The air burned her lungs, sharp and dry. For a moment she simply stood there, listening. Then she heard it again. A low, broken sound carried across the frozen fields, not wind, not timber cracking. It was the strained cry of livestock. She turned toward the eastern pasture. The neighbor who had once tipped his hat and laughed now stood in the open yard of his farm, his shoulders bent in a way she had never seen. His barn doors were wide, hanging crooked on their hinges. A small group of men moved in and out, their faces pale against the snow. Even from a distance she could tell something had gone wrong. She did not rush. She walked back into her own barn first, lifted the trapdoor, and made her way down the ramp. The cellar smelled of straw and warm breath. The cattle lifted their heads when they heard her boots. Steam rose gently from their backs, but the air did not bite. The water trough held a thin layer of ice she easily cracked with a small hammer. She checked each animal with steady hands. All were standing. She let out a breath she did not know she was holding. The earth had done its work again. When she climbed back up, the sound from the eastern farm had grown louder. A wagon creaked down the road, heading that way. Smoke no longer rose from that chimney. By midday, word had reached her gate without anyone needing to speak it. The neighbor had lost nearly half his herd in the night. The cold had seeped through every wall, freezing water buckets solid and turning breath to frost on the animals' hides. Some had collapsed where they stood, others had not risen at all. The same news traveled from the western ridge, and from the small farm near the river bend. Winter had not shown mercy. By late afternoon, 3 men approached her property. Their boots dragged through the snow, and none of them carried the easy grin she remembered from autumn. They stopped by her fence, clearing their throats as if the words would not come. "We heard," one finally said, staring at the barn roof instead of her face. "We heard your stock made it through." She studied them quietly. These were the same men who had leaned on flour barrels and joked about burying cattle alive. The same voices that had called her foolish for digging beneath the barn. Now their coats hung heavy with frost, and their hands shook despite thick gloves. "They're holding on," she replied. A long pause followed. The wind picked up loose snow and carried it between them. One of the men shifted his weight. "Would you mind," he began slowly, "if we saw it?" "The cellar." She hesitated, not out of pride, but caution. The ramp was narrow. The space beneath the barn was built for her herd, not a crowd of curious neighbors. Still, she saw something in their faces that softened her resolve. It was not only fear, it was desperation. She led them inside. The barn above creaked under the weight of snow, but the trapdoor opened smoothly. The men followed her down the sloped path, ducking their heads as the air changed around them. The cellar was not warm like a summer day, but it was steady. Not the biting cold of the open fields. Not the frozen stillness that had taken so many animals overnight. The cattle shifted but did not panic. One of the men reached out a gloved hand and touched a broad flank. His eyes widened when he felt the warmth beneath the hide. "It's the ground," she said quietly. "It keeps what it gathers." They looked at the stone lining along the base, at the timber supports, at the narrow vents she adjusted with care. One knelt near the water trough, running his fingers through the slush instead of solid ice. Outside, the valley felt broken. Inside, beneath the barn, life continued. When they climbed back up, their expressions had changed, not quite relief, not quite understanding, something in between. "You figured this out alone?" one asked. She nodded once. They left without another joke. That evening, as the sun dipped behind a bank of clouds, a different kind of gathering formed near her gate. This time it was not only men. Women came too, their shawls wrapped tight, eyes scanning the fields as if measuring their own losses. Children stood close to their mothers' skirts, unusually quiet. The valley had always been proud. Farmers here believed in their own strength. Asking for help felt like admitting weakness. Yet winter had stripped away that comfort in a single night. A woman stepped forward, her voice trembling. "How deep did you dig?" she asked. "And how did you keep it from caving in?" The questions came faster after that, about airflow, about moisture, about cost. Some asked in practical tones, others with thinly veiled worry. A few cast sideways glances at the eastern ridge, where smoke still did not rise. She answered as best she could, but she did not offer promises. This cellar had taken months of work. It had taken planning and stubbornness and long nights with blistered hands. It was not a quick fix. And winter was far from over. Another storm system was already forming beyond the plains. She could feel it in the way the air shifted at dusk, heavy and restless. The sky took on a pale color that farmers recognized as trouble. The valley had survived the first blow, but the season still held its sharpest teeth. Over the next few days, her farm became a place of quiet movement. Men arrived with measuring ropes and notebooks. They studied the slope of her land, the thickness of her barn floor, the angle of the vents. Some asked if they could begin digging right away. She watched them from her porch, torn between sympathy and unease. The ground beneath her barn had not been chosen at random. She had tested it for weeks before putting a shovel to soil. The drainage had to be right. The foundation had to hold. A mistake could bring the whole structure down. A rushed attempt in frozen ground could trap animals instead of saving them. She told them so. A few listened carefully. Others looked past her words, already thinking of their own barns, their own herds, their own sinking losses. Fear made people impatient. One night, a knock sounded at her door long after dark. She opened it to find the eastern neighbor standing alone, hat in hand. Snow clung to his coat. "I misjudged you," he said without preamble. The words hung between them. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer excuses. Instead, he spoke of the animals he had lost, of the silence in his barn where there had once been steady breathing, of how he had walked through the stalls that morning and felt as though winter had stolen more than cattle. She listened. When he finished, he looked up at her with something close to humility. "There's another freeze coming," he said. "Colder than the last. They say I've got what's left of my herd. I won't make it through another night like that." The wind pressed against the door as if listening too. She glanced toward her barn, toward the earth-walled cellar where her own animals stood shoulder to shoulder. There was space, but not much. Bringing in more cattle would crowd the air, strain the feed, test the vents. "Let me see what I can do," she replied. He nodded, not daring to hope too much. After he left, she walked out to the barn with her lantern. The moon cast long shadows across the snow. She descended into the cellar and stood among her cattle, feeling the steady rhythm of their breathing. Each animal represented months of work, of careful feeding and tending. Taking in more would mean risk, but turning away would mean something else. She climbed back up and stood in the cold for a long while, listening to the valley. In the distance, hammers began to strike wood. Some neighbors had already started digging beneath their own barns, despite the frozen ground. The sound carried faintly, mixed with the rising wind. Winter was tightening its grip. By morning, clouds rolled in thick and low. The air felt heavier than before. She opened her gate before the eastern neighbor arrived, leading a small group of his remaining cattle through the snow. The animals looked thinner than they should, their coats dulled by stress. She guided them down the ramp slowly, adjusting the vents wider to keep the air moving. The space beneath the barn grew tighter, the warmth rising slightly with the added bodies. Above them, the sky darkened. Across the valley, others dug with frantic energy. Some had little choice. The forecast carried on the wind promised record-breaking cold. Not just a passing freeze, but a deep, bone-setting chill that could last for days. That afternoon, as she measured out feed with careful hands, a distant cracking sound split the air. Not thunder, not wind. Timber giving way. She froze, listening. Another crack followed, sharper this time, echoing from the western ridge. Voices rose faintly in the distance, urgent and strained. She set down the feed scoop and climbed the ramp 2 steps at a time. The barn door flew open under her hand, snow whipping in with the wind. Far across the fields, a plume of powder shot into the air as part of a roof collapsed under the weight of ice. The valley was unraveling. She stood there, heart steady but heavy, knowing that the cellar beneath her feet was strong but not invincible. The added cattle shifted below, their hooves scraping softly against packed earth. The next wave of cold had arrived. And this time it would test more than timber and soil. The cold settled in like a heavy hand that would not lift. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped so sharply that even the snow seemed to harden in place. The wind did not howl this time. It moved in slow, steady breaths, pressing against walls and slipping under doors, patient and relentless. The kind of cold that did not need noise to make its point. She stood in her barn doorway, watching the last of the light fade over the valley. Smoke rose from fewer chimneys now. The roof that had cracked on the western ridge lay half-collapsed, a dark shape against the white field. Lanterns flickered there as neighbors worked to salvage what they could before the deep freeze tightened further. Beneath her boots, under layers of timber and packed earth, the cellar held more life than it had ever been meant to carry. The added cattle shifted restlessly. The air below was warmer than outside, but not by much. With every animal brought in from the eastern farm, the balance changed. More breath meant more moisture. More warmth meant a greater need for careful ventilation. She had opened the vents wider before dusk, then adjusted them again as the wind changed direction. Now she worried whether she had judged it right. She made her way down the ramp with her lantern, careful with each step. The animals lifted their heads as she entered. They sensed the change in weather long before people did. A low murmur passed through the herd, hooves scraping straw. She moved slowly among them, counting in her head. Her own cattle pressed along one wall. The eastern neighbors' herd clustered near the center, uncertain and crowded. She ran her hand along a thin flank and felt a tremble beneath the hide. "We will hold?" she whispered, though she was not sure whether she spoke to the animal or to herself. Above ground, the valley had begun to split along quiet lines. Some farmers had refused to dig beneath their barns even after seeing her cellar. They believed in tradition, in doing things as they always had. They stacked extra hay against barn walls, sealed cracks with boards, and prayed for a shift in the weather. Pride ran deep in the soil here. So did fear of change. Others had started digging in a rush, hacking at frozen ground with picks and shovels. A few had already hit water pockets beneath their barns, turning their hurried cellars into muddy pits. One family near the river had to pull their livestock back out after the floor began to sink. The town was learning that copying an idea was not the same as understanding it. Near midnight, a knock sounded at her barn door. She climbed the ramp and opened it to find two young men from the western ridge. Their faces were pale, their breath clouding thick in the air. "Our barn won't hold," one said. "The beams cracked after the roof gave way. We patched it best we could, but the wind's getting in from every side." She hesitated, the weight of her own herd pressing against her thoughts. "How many do you have left?" "6," the other answered. "We lost 4 last week. 6 more bought us. 6 more mouths to feed. 6 more breaths in the tight space below." She looked back at the trapdoor, then at the dark fields beyond them. Turning them away meant likely loss. Taking them in meant stretching her cellar to its limit. "I'll help you move them," she said at last. It took nearly an hour to guide the animals through snow that cut at their legs. The wind stung their eyes. Twice, one stumbled and had to be steadied. When they reached her barn, she led them down carefully, adjusting the straw to make space. The cellar grew more crowded, the warmth more noticeable. The air felt thicker. She opened one vent slightly more, letting a narrow stream of colder air slip in. It was a delicate balance. Too little air, and moisture would build, leading to sickness. Too much, and the cold would undo all the protection the earth provided. As she climbed back up, she felt the first thread of doubt tighten in her chest. By morning, frost coated the inside of her barn doors. The valley looked smaller somehow, as if the cold had shrunk it inward. Smoke rose again from the western ridge, but thin and unsteady. People began to talk in quieter tones now. Not about her foolishness, but about fairness. At the general store, where shelves had grown sparse from delayed deliveries, a heated conversation had taken place the day before. Some argued that she should open her cellar to all, that her farm had become the only reliable shelter in the valley. Others insisted it was not her burden to carry everyone's herd. "She built it for herself," one man had said. "She owes no one, but if she can save them," another countered. "And doesn't, what then?" The words traveled faster than the storm clouds. That afternoon, a small wagon rolled up to her gate carrying feed sacks. The eastern neighbor stepped down and removed his hat. "For the extra mouths," he said simply. She accepted the sacks without comment, but the gesture eased something inside her. This was not charity, it was shared risk. Still, not all were grateful. Near dusk, another farmer approached on horseback, his expression tight. He did not dismount. "I hear you're taking in cattle," he said, voice clipped. "Some," she replied. He glanced toward her barn, jaw set. "You didn't come to me, you didn't ask." His eyes hardened. "You're playing favorites." The accusation hung heavy in the cold air. "I'm doing what I can," she answered evenly. The cellar has limits. Maybe if you hadn't hidden it from the rest of us until it was too late, we'd all have had time to prepare. She felt the sting of that, hidden, as if she had kept a secret on purpose. As if the laughter she endured had not been public enough. "I dug in plain sight," she said quietly. "No one stopped you from picking up a shovel." He had no answer to that. He turned his horse sharply and rode off, leaving churned snow in his wake. Beneath the barn, the animals grew restless as evening settled. The space that once felt steady now hummed with nervous energy. Too many bodies pressed close. The warmth had risen another notch. Moisture gathered along the timber supports, forming droplets that clung and fell. She wiped one beam with her sleeve and felt the dampness. This was the risk she had feared. If sickness took hold down here, it would spread quickly. If the air grew stale, the very shelter meant to save them could become a trap. She climbed back up and stood outside, studying the sky. The clouds were thick and unmoving, no break in sight. The forecast carried by the rail line weeks ago had warned of record-breaking cold across the plains. This was not a passing storm. It was a season making its mark. A group of townsfolk approached again, this time not with questions but with plans. One carried a rough sketch of a cellar. Another had measurements scribbled on a scrap of paper. They wanted her advice before they dug further. She walked with them to a nearby farm where the ground beneath the barn had been half dug and left uneven. Ice had formed along the exposed edges. The support beams were thin and poorly placed. "This won't hold," she said, tapping one beam with her glove. "You need thicker timber, and you must brace the corners before you dig deeper." The farmer's wife stood nearby, worry etched across her face. "We don't have time to redo it," she said. "The cold will be worse tomorrow." She knew that look. It was the same one she had worn the winter she buried her first cow. "You don't have time to do it wrong," she replied gently. They worked by lantern light, reinforcing the structure as best they could. Even so, she could feel the frost creeping up from the ground, making every swing of the hammer slower. When she returned home, well after dark, exhaustion weighed on her shoulders. She had become something she never intended to be. Not just a farmer, but a guide. A measure of whether others would survive the season. And still, her own barn groaned under the strain. Near midnight, a sharp cough echoed from below. Not wind, not timber. An animal. She grabbed her lantern and descended quickly. The air felt thicker than before. One of the western ridge cows stood apart from the rest, head low. Its breath came in uneven bursts. She knelt beside it, pressing her hand along its side. The hide felt warmer than it should. Moisture clung to its nostrils. Too much warmth, too much closeness. She adjusted the nearest vent, letting in a sharper stream of cold air. The draft cut across her face, but the cellar needed it. The other animals shifted, reacting to the change. "Hold on," she murmured. The cough came again, softer this time. Above her, the barn creaked as wind pressed against its walls. Somewhere in the valley, another beam snapped, the sound carrying faint but clear. She looked around at the packed earth walls she had trusted so deeply, at the stone lining. At the timber braces she had measured and set herself. The cellar was strong, but it was no longer just hers. It carried the weight of the valley's hope and the strain of its fear. If the cold deepened further, if sickness spread among the crowded herd, if one beam shifted under the pressure, everything beneath this barn could change in a single night. She stayed there until her lantern burned low, listening to the breathing of the animals and the slow, steady groan of winter above them. By the third night of the deep freeze, the valley no longer felt like home. It felt like something being tested in a furnace made of ice. The temperature kept dropping, not in sudden swings, but in slow, stubborn degrees that made even strong timber groan. Frost crept along the inside of windows. Wells stiffened. The river that had frozen weeks ago now looked like a sheet of iron. People moved with their heads down, saving breath, saving strength. Beneath her barn, the cellar held more life than it ever had. The air was warmer now, thick with the breath of too many cattle pressed close together. She could feel the change the moment she stepped down the ramp. It was not the biting cold of the open fields, but it was no longer steady either. It carried weight. The cow that had coughed the night before still stood, but its breathing was uneven. She had separated it as best she could, shifting straw and guiding a small pocket of space near a vent. She checked its eyes, its nose, the warmth beneath its hide. The signs were not clear yet, not sickness, not health. Something in between. She adjusted the vents again, her fingers stiff from cold. A narrow slice of winter air cut through the cellar, slicing across her cheeks. Some of the animals shifted in discomfort, but she forced herself to hold the vent open a little longer. Airflow was everything now. Too much warmth would turn against them. Above ground, the barn roof cracked under the strain of ice. Snow had drifted against the northern wall so high that it nearly reached the lower window. She had climbed up twice that day to shovel off what she could, her boots slipping on frozen boards. The added weight of snow worried her almost as much as the crowded cellar below. By morning, a line of people had formed near her gate. They did not come with laughter anymore. They came with red faces and tight expressions, carrying feed sacks, tools, even small offerings of dried meat and firewood. The unspoken understanding had shifted. This farm, once mocked, had become the valley's thin line of hope, but hope came with pressure. A young couple stood near the front of the line, their gloved hands intertwined. They had only 3 cows left. Their barn had begun to lean after days of wind. The husband's voice cracked as he asked if there was any space left. She looked at them, then back toward her barn. She could picture every inch of that cellar without stepping inside. She knew where each animal stood. She knew the space left along the far wall near the stone base. It was narrow. It would push the limits. "Bring them," she said at last. As the small herd was led down the ramp, the cellar shifted again, more warmth. More breath? More risk? The eastern neighbor arrived shortly after with a different look in his eyes. "There's talk," he said quietly. "Some folks think you're choosing who gets saved." She met his gaze evenly. "I'm choosing what the cellar can hold. They're scared," he said. "When fear sets in, people forget what they once believed." She knew that was true. Fear had a way of twisting memory. The same mouths that once called her foolish now spoke of fairness and obligation. A few even muttered that her underground barn was unnatural, that the earth was not meant to hold so many animals. She felt anger flicker for the first time in days, but she pushed it down. Anger would not hold up beams or keep cattle breathing. That afternoon, the wind shifted sharply to the north. It carried a deeper chill, one that made her skin prickle even through thick wool. The forecast had warned of record-breaking temperatures. Now, the valley felt as though it stood on the edge of that promise. The coughing cow worsened. Its breathing grew louder, rough around the edges. She mixed warm water with a small portion of molasses and guided it gently to the animal's mouth. The cow swallowed weakly. Around them, the rest of the herd shifted, the sound of hooves scraping earth filling the tight space. Moisture gathered along the ceiling beams. A slow drip began in one corner. She wiped it away, heart pounding. If the cellar grew too damp, illness would spread. If illness spread, the packed space would turn dangerous fast. She needed airflow, but outside the temperature was dropping to levels the valley had not seen in years. By dusk, frost had begun to form along the edges of the ramp itself. The cold was pushing downward, testing the earth's hold. She stood at the top of the ramp and listened to the wind move across the prairie. It sounded different now, lower, heavier. From the western ridge came another sharp crack. Not timber this time, something else. A small group of men rushed down the road toward her farm, their boots slipping in the packed snow. One waved his arms as he approached. "The Miller barn's gone," he shouted over the wind. Collapsed clean through, her stomach tightened. The Miller family had tried to dig their own cellar, but had stopped halfway when the ground turned too hard. They had trusted the reinforced barn walls instead. "How many left?" she asked. "2 calves," he replied. "The rest didn't make it." The words hung heavy between them. Loss was becoming a common sound in the valley. The man glanced toward her barn. "They're asking if you can take the calves?" She closed her eyes for a brief moment. Calves were smaller, easier to fit. But they were also fragile. They would need warmth and care. "Bring them before dark," she said. As the calves were carried down the ramp wrapped in blankets, the cellar reached its true limit. Animals stood shoulder to shoulder now, their bodies forming a wall of living heat. The air moved through the vents, but only just. She made one more adjustment, widening the southern vent slightly despite the biting draft that followed. A few animals flinched at the sudden cold stream, but she held firm. Balance was everything. That night, the valley seemed to hold its breath. The temperature dropped lower than it had all season. Ice formed along the inside of her barn walls. The wooden beams creaked in slow protest. She climbed to the roof one last time with a shovel, scraping off a thick layer of snow under a sky that looked hard and distant. As she climbed down, a shadow moved near her fence. The farmer who had accused her days before stood there, his face drawn tight. "I was wrong," he said without preface. "About you," she said nothing, waiting. "My barn won't last the night," he continued. "I've got 4 left. I know you're full. I can see it in your face, but I had to ask." There it was again. The weight of choice. She looked at the snow piled high against her barn, at the roof that sagged slightly under the load. She thought of the crowded cellar, of the coughing cow, of the calves curled close together. 4 more bodies would push everything past safe measure. "I don't know," she admitted. He nodded slowly as if he had expected that answer. "I'll stay with them," he said. "If they go, they won't go alone." He turned to leave, and something inside her tightened. The valley had begun this winter divided by laughter and pride. Now it stood on the edge of something else. "Wait," she called. He stopped but did not turn. "I'll come see," she said. They walked together through snow that reached their knees. His barn leaned visibly now, one beam bowed under the strain. Inside, the 4 cattle huddled close, their breath turning to frost in the air. She ran her hand along the nearest flank. The hide felt cold. The wind howled once, hard enough to rattle the loose boards. Her mind moved quickly, measuring space, counting feed, calculating airflow. It would be tight, dangerous, but leaving them here felt worse. "We moved them," she said. It took nearly an hour to guide the animals back through the storm. By the time they reached her farm, the sky had turned a deep, endless black. Snow blew sideways, cutting across their faces. When the last animal stepped down into the cellar, the space felt completely filled. No extra inches, no open corners. The coughing cow lay down at last, its sides rising and falling unevenly. The calves nestled against a larger cow for warmth. The air hummed with the sound of breathing. She stood in the center of it all, lantern light flickering against packed earth walls. Every beam, every vent, every stone lining mattered now. One failure would ripple through the entire space. Above them, the barn groaned as the wind struck full force. Snow slammed against the walls. A loud crack split the night, close and sharp. She froze, listening. Another crack followed, this time from the roofline. The farmer beside her looked up instinctively, though all he could see was the low cellar ceiling. "Will it hold?" he asked quietly. She did not answer right away. She listened to the breathing of the herd, to the wind tearing across the prairie, to the slow strain of timber above. The earth had held so far. The cellar had saved what the open barns could not. But never had it been tested like this. The wind roared again, stronger than before, and the barn shuddered hard enough to send a faint shower of dust drifting from the ceiling beams. She lifted her lantern higher, eyes scanning every support, every joint in the wood. Outside, something heavy slammed against the barn wall. Inside, the coughing cow let out one long, strained breath, and the roof groaned once more, louder than ever. The roof groaned again, louder than ever, and for a brief second the whole barn seemed to hold its breath. She felt it through the solace of her boots, a deep shudder running down the beams and into the packed earth walls of the cellar. Dust drifted from the ceiling. One of the calves bleated softly. The farmer beside her stiffened, his eyes wide in the lantern light. Then came the sound of something sliding. Snow. A heavy mass of it shifted across the roof and spilled down the northern side in a long, rushing sweep. The weight lightened all at once. The barn frame creaked sharply, then settled. They both stood still, listening. The wind howled again, but the sharp cracking sound did not return. The beams above continued to groan, yet there was a different tone now, less strain, more resistance. The barn had not given way. She let out a slow breath she had been holding since the first crack. "Stay here," she told the farmer. She climbed the ramp quickly and pushed open the barn door. The storm hit her face hard, but she forced herself to look up. In the faint glow of her lantern, she saw that a thick slab of snow had slid off the roof and fallen in a heavy drift along the side. The sag in the roofline looked less severe now. The northern wall still stood straight. The barn had held. She moved along the outer wall, pressing her gloved hands against the timber. Solid. Shaken, but solid. The cellar beneath had not shifted. The foundation, strengthened by the packed earth and stone lining, had done more than protect the cattle. It had helped support the entire structure from below. When she stepped back inside and descended again, the farmer's shoulders had lowered slightly. "It's holding," she said. He nodded, eyes shining in the dim light. "You built more than a hole in the ground." She glanced around the crowded cellar. The air was cold enough now from the widened vents to keep the moisture from building further. The coughing cow still lay on the straw, but its breathing had slowed, no longer as strained. The calves were tucked tightly against a larger cow, their small bodies warmed by the living wall around them. They would need to make it through the night. That was the next test. She did not leave the cellar until dawn. The wind raged for hours, but the barn stood. The earth walls held steady. The vents pulled in just enough of the frigid air to keep sickness from spreading, while the mass of cattle generated a shared warmth that no open barn could have provided. When the sky finally began to lighten, pale and quiet after the storm's fury, the valley looked different. The cold remained, but the wind had calmed. Snow lay in thick waves across the fields, glittering under the first thin light of morning. Smoke began to rise again from chimneys, cautious but present. She stepped out into the yard, her body aching from a sleepless night. Across the valley, people were emerging from their homes, scanning roofs and fences, counting what remained. The Miller family walked slowly down the road toward her farm. The farmer who had once accused her followed not far behind. The eastern neighbor came as well, his boots crunching in the snow. They stopped near her gate, not speaking at first. "Well," the eastern neighbor asked quietly, "how did it fare?" She turned toward the barn and opened the door wide. One by one, the townsfolk followed her down the ramp. The cellar felt cooler now, balanced. The herd stood tightly packed but calm. No new coughing echoed in the space. The calves lifted their heads, blinking in the soft light. A murmur passed through the group, not loud, not wild, just steady relief. The farmer, who had brought his last 4 cattle the night before, placed his hand on the stone lining of the wall and shook his head slowly. "You saved them," he said. She looked around at the animals. "We saved them?" she corrected. "All of us." It was true. The extra feed sacks stacked neatly along the wall had come from neighbors. The reinforcement of a support beam the night before had been done with borrowed timber. The valley had begun to work together when pride finally gave way to necessity. Above ground, the damage across other farms was real. Several barns had partially collapsed under the weight of snow. Livestock losses were heavy in some places. But the deep freeze had passed without wiping out the valley entirely. Over the next few days, as temperatures slowly climbed back to something bearable, people gathered not in whispers, but in open conversation. They walked her fields, studied the barn foundation, measured the depth of the cellar. This time there was no laughter. Instead, there were questions asked with respect. "How thick did you pack the earth? What stone did you use along the base? How did you judge?" "The vent size," she answered each one plainly. There was no secret formula, no miracle. It had been planning, observation, and a willingness to try something different when the old way failed. By the end of the week, shovels struck ground across the valley again, but not in panic. This time the digging was careful. Timbers were measured properly. Stone was laid with attention. The farmers worked together, sharing tools and advice, reinforcing one another's barns with an understanding that winter on the plains did not play favorites. The coughing cow recovered slowly. Fresh air and space, once the worst of the cold had lifted, helped it regain strength. The calves found their footing and began to nudge at feed with new energy. As space opened up in the cellar, some of the borrowed cattle were led back to their own farms, into newly dug underground shelters built stronger than before. The farmer who had accused her most sharply came one afternoon with a team of men and reinforced her barn roof without being asked. They cleared snow, replaced weakened boards, and added extra support beams beneath the rafters. "We figure," he said gruffly, avoiding her eyes. "If this place holds the valley together, it ought to be the strongest roof out here." She gave him a small nod. That was apology enough. Spring did not arrive all at once, but it came. The sun began to linger longer in the sky. Snow melted in slow streams along fence lines. The river cracked open and began to move again, carrying broken ice downstream. Grass pushed up where white drifts had once stood. The valley, scarred but standing, began to breathe differently. One evening, as the last of the shared cattle were led back to their own pastures, the townsfolk gathered near her barn. Not in fear, not in desperation, in gratitude. Children ran along the fence, laughing in the softer air. Women brought pies and bread. The men spoke openly about plans for better barns, deeper foundations, and shared workdays before the next winter came. Someone mentioned how they used to laugh when she first began digging beneath the barn. She smiled slightly. "It was loud enough," she said. A quiet chuckle moved through the group, but it held no mockery. Only acknowledgement. The eastern neighbor stepped forward. "We thought you were burying your farm," he said. "Turns out you were building its future." She looked out across the valley at the fields that had tested every one of them. The farm beneath the barn had not just saved livestock. It had changed how they saw one another. The lesson ran deeper than packed earth and stone walls. Preparation mattered. Observation mattered. And sometimes the old American way was not about doing what had always been done, but about having the courage to improve it. When the next winter came, the valley looked different. Nearly every barn had a cellar beneath it. Not identical, but inspired. Vent systems were tested before the first frost. Roofs were reinforced before the first snowfall. Farmers compared notes instead of competing pride. And when the wind carried sound across the fields, it no longer brought laughter aimed at one stubborn woman and her strange idea. It carried the steady noise of a community that had learned to stand together. On cold nights, she still walked down into her cellar, lantern in hand, checking the cattle one by one. The earth walls felt familiar beneath her palm. The vents moved smoothly under her fingers. Above her, the barn stood strong, supported from below as much as from above. She no longer heard whispers of foolishness in town. Instead, young farmers asked her advice before they built. Children spoke of the winter that froze livestock across the plains, and of the farm beneath the barn that held fast when others failed. She did not think of herself as a hero. She thought of herself as someone who paid attention. The valley never forgot that winter. It became part of its story, passed down as a reminder that pride could be as dangerous as cold, and that preparation could turn the harshest storm into a lesson rather than a disaster. And each time the wind rose across the fields, brushing against barn walls and rattling doors, there was no longer fear in the sound. Only respect for the land, for winter, and for the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let laughter decide her fate.